You are listening to Unscripted Moments, a podcast about propaganda, where each week we break down a different propaganda song. On this episode, we are talking about Name and Address Withheld, track 10 from the fourth full-length LP, Potemkin City Limits, which came out in October of 2005 on Fat Records. Keith, how are you this evening?
Greg, I am good, and although this song is going to be difficult to talk about, I am excited to hear what you have to say and to share my thoughts as well.
Well, on this song, we have, a song that came in the middle of a record that has the Iraq War explicitly at the heart of several songs. This track and the closer iteration include rebukes of patriotism, nationalism, militarism, and propaganda are found pretty much throughout this entire record. And I'm also excited about this one because these are things that surround us in so many ways in the time and place in which we currently are living, which is a post-2020 election United States. So there's a lot of things that are really relevant here, and I'm really glad to get into it with you.
Yeah, it's scary and unfortunate how topical many of the ideas in Name and Address are still here with us in 2020.
Before we dive into it, at the beginning of this episode, I put a little audio clip that said coming soon to a screen near you. And I want to tell a little bit of the backstory before we get into that. That was from a YouTube video clip of me on a train in Chicago back in 2006 when I was quoting this song in normal everyday conversation with my friends, just riding the train around Chicago. So this is a song, Name and Address Withheld, that has been deeply ingrained in my life ever since I first heard the G7 compilation version in the summer of 2005 in the lead up to this record, and also on the release of the Live from Occupied Territories DVD. So this is a song that I have a long-standing connection to and is among my earliest memories involving anything from Potemkin City Limits. So this is kind of like where Potemkin started for me in general. Was this the first one you heard off the record?
I think I don't remember actually what I heard first. I know they had a website, right? And they released a few songs at a time. And I don't know if I kept up with everything or if I just waited to hear the album first, but I don't have any memory of hearing this one before the album came out.
Interesting. I'm kind of surprised that you weren't all over that G7 compilation. Was it just that you hadn't really connected to that G7 world of releases yet at that time in 2005?
Yeah, that I was not really familiar with. Quite often, I usually just hold off on hearing any previews or singles or promotional content just to hear an album in its entirety, to hear the entire thing together.
Mm-hmm.
So that might have been it, or it could have just been, I don't know, laziness or being unaware and not tracking it down. But yeah, I'm pretty sure America's Army, was that one of the first songs released?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, so I think I heard that first. That seems to stand out. And then, then I would have gotten the album after that.
Well, this is definitely my earliest memory from this record. And what's so funny is that recently on Chris Hanna's podcast on Patreon, he did a deep dive into the song Rock for Sustainable Capitalism. But in that episode, he got into the history of Name and Address Withheld also within that episode. So that episode kind of has like a 2-in-1 feel where he talked a lot about this song in particular, because there are two versions of this song floating around out there. One was mixed by Chris, which came out on the G7 Take Penicillin Now compilation in 2005, whose opening track on that compilation was actually Swallowing Shit too, with Todd Kowalski, by the way. So there are two versions of this tune out there, one mixed by Chris Hanna himself and one mixed by Jason Livermore at the Blasting Room. And the Blasting Room version is the one that appears on the LP, but Chris talks about trying to mix this entire record himself. And this is like the song where there's two mixes available that made it out into the public. So there's like two separate versions of the song with the same recorded tracks, but different mixes, one by Chris and one by the great Jason Livermore at the Blasting Room. So I thought that was a really cool little detail of hearing Chris talk about recording this song and in the studios in Canada, and then trying to mix it himself and trying to make the record sound like South of Heaven by Slayer, which was amazing. But then realizing halfway through that the feedback he was getting from people who were pre-listening to his mix versions, that it wasn't up to the standard that it was capable of achieving. So then Chris sent it over to Jason Livermore to mix for big bucks. And you can totally hear the whole story, which Chris tells on Patreon. And it's absolutely hilarious the way that he tells it, because he's just such a great storyteller. But, the mix that Chris did has huge kick drums in like the entire outro section in the wishing them so many more unhappy returns parts, like huge kick drums. It's like 80s Slayer, seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are some major differences in the song, and Livermore's version is much more pleasing to listen to, where when I listen to Chris's version, it's incredible how heavy and fast this song sounds. When on the Potemkin mix, it feels like it has a much lighter, bouncier feel, even though it's essentially the same recorded tracks.
Join his Patreon and you can read his notes on some of the lyrics, which he recently wrote up, as well as hear that alternate version.
Yeah. And we'll get into those lyrics here in a few minutes after our interview. But, this is one of those records where I think that things were kind of bleak and dark in the band at that time. I was reading this interview on punknews.org where the interviewer asked Chris, you guys have started announcing tour dates, and I'm wondering what kind of touring plans you have in store for the next year. And Chris says, no real plans. I'm staying out of that shit as much as possible. The idea of spending my days in a moving vehicle and my evenings in a stinking club and my nights in a hotel makes me want to stick dynamite in my eyes. And then the interviewer says, any other plans for next year that you'd be able to share with us? And Chris says, hoping to off myself. And I was like, wow. Yikes. So,
yeah, wow.
The tone of Chris in that interview, I'm sure that he was just like, oh God, I'm giving an interview to Punk News. And probably didn't want to be doing that. But it was a bleak conversation, which is fairly in line with, the feel for Potemkin in general. So,
yeah, so let's get into our interview. We talked to Dr. Christopher Deutsch again, who was our first guest on the podcast way back in episode number 3 for Cop Just Out of Frame. So we're glad to be able to talk to him about Name and Address Withheld.
Absolutely. And what's really cool about that Cop Just Out of Frame episode is that it is still by far our most downloaded episode. In our chat with Chris, we discuss his military service, his jobs he performed in the military, his attachment to this particular song, some major observations about being military, being a history professor now, and loving propaganda. And so many people gave us great feedback about Chris's appearance on the Cop Just Out of Frame episode. So it's fantastic to have this amazing scholarly approach to the show. And we're grateful that Chris has returned to hang out with us. So without further delay, please enjoy our conversation with Dr. Chris Deutsch. Chris Deutsch, welcome back to Unscripted Moments, the podcast about propaganda.
Glad to be back.
It is wonderful to have you back, Chris. I know that the audience have been huge fans of your episode that you did for the song Cop Just Out of Frame back on episode 3. We're just so happy that you were willing to come back and hang out with us for a repeat appearance, hopefully the second of several more. So, Chris, today we're going to talk about the song Name and Address Withheld in just a little bit. But before we dive into the topic at hand, I want to talk a little bit about something that you mentioned at the end of your Cop Just Out of Frame appearance, where you talked about being a veteran in the armed forces of the United States. And Keith and I were chatting, and we know that you served in the 82nd Airborne Division from 1998 to 2002. And we're hoping that you could share a little bit with our listeners about your service, particularly your roles, responsibilities, and work as a combat engineer paratrooper.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little known kind of job, but it's critical to the way the U.S. military is put together. From the ashes of World War II, during World War II, when modern military kind of really emerged. And It was to jump out of airplanes, secure airfields for later troop deployments, and keep the mobility units, the infantry, free from minefields and any kind of booby traps that they may encounter, while also laying the same ourselves. And in addition to that, serving as backup infantry or line infantry as needed.
Where did those years take you from 98 to '02? Where were you in the world?
Yeah, so I had one major deployment. That was Kosovo in 1999, part of the end of the Baltic Civil War of the 1990s, and the Kosovars were engaged in a long battle with Serbia. And once that sort of died down, there was some U.S. support in the form of bombing, and I was deployed to originally to secure the air units, and then I rolled in with the first group to secure Kosovo for the U.S. military.
Do you have any like day to day on the ground, like what your life was like during that deployment? Like, I'm just curious, like on the minutia that you remember, things that stick out.
Yeah, the smell of sheep fields, because we first deployed to Albania inside a sheep field. It was an old Soviet airbase. So there's a kind of smell about the earth that, because we lived in cots and tents for many months, that I became very familiar with. And then, rolling into Kosovo, going through the refugee camps and seeing what that was all like, getting exposed to the local people, local area, having like fresh made Turkish coffee, which was a treat that we would sneak on patrols. I don't know. Yeah, just what it's like to be in a weird quasi combat position that I didn't see any combat. It wasn't a true combat deployment, especially in regards to 2001 and beyond. But it was also like an edgy kind of situation because the Kosovars were still fighting, and that's currently an international kind of disaster as far as the war crimes and whatnot, both sides. And we knew something was going on, and we knew black units or special ops or whatever from the U.S. had been doing stuff, but that wasn't my experience.
So the U.S. began its attacks on Afghanistan in October 2001 and launched its invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. What was it like to watch the Iraq War unfold just after serving in the Army?
Yeah, it's weird. I have, in many ways, a decently typical veteran experience, but as with all life experiences, some things about it are, particular, in that I was uniquely exposed to thinking about 9/11 because I was under full lockdown for 30 days starting on September 11th, that Tuesday, because that's when I started non-commissioned officer training, was that day. So it was like this weird time where it was just us in our barracks, not connected to our units, really limited access to the outside world in general. And I very much do I remember Bush's 9/11 speech, and it haunts me to this day. It's when I realized that as much as I was basically kidding myself about the military, that to be, Dead Kennedys fan in high school or an Op Ivy fan in high school, and then to sign up thinking that like I could walk that moral path was not something I was capable of doing. And I realized that this was a forever war, and it was going to start that day.
Do you remember, did you enlist when you were 18? Mm-hmm. Like straight out of high school?
Even worse. I enlisted the day I turned 18 in high school because I turned 18 9 months before I graduated, something like that.
Did you have any conflict with that, being like into like you just said, like you were talking about Dead Kennedys and Op Ivy? Did you have like a conflict that was running through your mind as you were enlisting, or was that something that you sort of separated out as being two separate things that you were trying to reconcile?
Yeah, my morality about military service wasn't really formed really harshly at the time. Instead, it would be more of a concern about what the military does to people, because as with so many kids born in the early 80s, late 70s, Vietnam War movies and being taught by Vietnam veterans in K-12 education deeply shaped me. And the military itself was known more as a place where you might have to do stuff that makes you a bad person, Charlie Sheen style, rather than a force that could actually engage in large-scale combat. And the only other real metaphor or simile or way to rhyme with what the military might be like would be World War II, in which, being against the liberation of, France or Poland is a bit harder to do. I mean, obviously, you can read people like Vonnegut and Zinn and get a more nuanced critique of World War II. But, as a young kid, and it's really something that I think propaganda really gets at is back in the 90s, the idea that there'd be another war just seemed absurd. Seemed like the absolute folly of crazy, cranky right-wingers who could only dream of a time when the U.S. military was active again. And that's kind of the military I signed up in, was assuming there'd be no more such thing as war.
It's almost hard for me to even remember that feeling. So let's talk a little bit more about Name and Address Withheld. As a historian, a punk, as a veteran, I'd imagine that you have some thoughts on this song shaped by your own personal experiences that I and Greg don't or can't have. So what does this song mean to you?
Yeah, I think this is a song that cuts at a darker experience of really trying to engage with, really trying to be someone who has to face the fact that the war started and you had no real ability to stop it, and then to wonder about the morality of the consequence of invading and, in fact, destroying another country. And of course, the album came out a little later, so by this point, Iraq has already descended into, would be a very, very long duration civil war. To try to make sense of the ways in which the pop culture people like Chris and myself, and I'm sure you guys grew up with, prepared you to see the world in a certain way, but then realizing that you're maybe not prepared to face the world that way. And as a historian, one of the topics I love to teach, and I haven't done any research on it, but it's one of the things I might do, is the political content of a late 70s, early 80s, or maybe even early 90s even, cartoons. That during the Reagan administration, with the relaxations of FCC regulations on kids programming that lasted until about 1990, 91, that the nature of kids cartoons changed right as other forces injected kids cartoons with a kind of hyper masculine, muscular, conservative driven foreign policy angle, where America is this like shining force for good in the world. And, G.I. Joe's got to bust up the terrorist organization Cobra, which is an amalgamation of a communist group from like the 007 days and the kind of terrorist organizations that caused Reagan to declare 1983, 1984 the year of terror. It's complicated, but it's like there's that angle that people like myself grew up with, thinking that, oh, by the way, we're the plucky rebels taking on this evil stuff. But of course, in reality, as adults, it's a different world. It's not so simple.
Yeah, let's dive in a little bit to the content of the song itself. Do you have any favorite lines from the lyrics in this song, or any particular ideas that really resonate and grab your attention as you're listening over the last several hours today?
Oh yeah, I mean, the opening is just brutal. I do remember first time listening to this in the album. It comes after some Todd songs where it kind of focuses into some of the earlier lyrical themes about the Iraq War and the War on Terror. And I noticed immediately, of course, that this is a song where he's saying that he's against what's most popular to think and say, saying that, that his views are not those of the prevailing order, who, in a very, harsh way of putting it, prostrate to the naked kings, of course, thinking of Bush and the Canadian government and the British government at the time, and ends up talking about how he has this kind of overdeveloped sense of vengeance based on growing up with Star Wars. And he brings up A New Hope being fed to him for breakfast in a way that really resonated, because, of course, breakfast cereals with all kinds of labels, from Gremlins to all kinds of stuff, like were stuff I grew up with. G.I. Joe cereal,
toys in the box too.
Yeah, I think it was a really perfect way to describe growing up at that time, with the kind of stuff that was kind of circulating within the entertainment itself. It wasn't necessarily something people talked about. But I think one of the things that's really powerful in bringing up A New Hope and Star Wars is the nature of the role of vengeance within the movies, and kind of how Bush framed the War on Terror as vengeance for 9/11, and with Iraq, it becomes preemptive.
Mhm.
which was, of course, a huge discussion at the time, where basically just a patently internationally illegal war was launched by the United States under the guise that the United States had the right to preemptively invade and attack countries that
Mhm.
it felt were imminent threats, or at least it could claim to be. And that puts the United States in the role of the empire instead of the plucky heroes. And the ending line for me, it still haunts me. And that is, in every war waged, only kings emerged unscathed. Because as a historian, I'm like, well, not really. Because I mean, after World War I, right? Like, how many kings survived?
Mm.
Actually, a lot of kings were brought down by World War I. But I think his main truth that he's getting at, right, is that it's the wealthy and the well-connected who do better and can even profit.
Mm.
The
You
people who
know,
are mostly hurt aren't the wealthy.
yeah. Well, and Chris, you also mentioned the Canadians and the Brits a second ago, and I'm curious if you can elaborate on that point a little bit, because in the United States right now, George Bush is undergoing like a national rehabilitation before our very eyes whenever he's compared to what we have now. And that's problematic in so many ways for all those things that happened during those years. But I'm also curious if you can also talk a little bit about the complicity of the Canadians and the Brits, because Propaganda being a Canadian band, I think that's important to bring up as well.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak too much to the Canadian situation. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit more murky about the details and the specifics, but the British situation is a bit more important because they were a key international partner under the Blair administration, which, appropriately enough, was somewhat decently analogous to Bill Clinton in terms of his place within the political spectrum, being a quasi-leftist who had moved a leftist party rightward, but was a Bush friend and close associate. As much as this was a U.S. centered war, the fact is that the Bush administration did manage to cobble together some semblance of an international alliance. Not quite the way his father did, not the way the people who stood opposed to Bush's foreign policy team would have if it was up to them, but certainly it was a somewhat of a semblance of an international community that did launch this war. And other governments do bear responsibilities to their own citizens, and whether or not it was popular or they listened, or how their own systems of governance either did or didn't respond to what people wanted. And this is where my lack of understanding of Canada in the late 90s or 2000s fails me, since I cannot speak to what it was like on Canadian television or walking down the street, what you could expect to hear.
That's totally fine. Well, and I have one more question about the lyrics. You mentioned that the last line haunts you. In every war waged, only kings emerge unscathed. So, Chris, you're a veteran. You didn't get like deployed into a major military situation, but you know a lot of people, and I would imagine that you felt the scathing nature of what was happening to young people being sent off to fight in these wars deeply. Can you chat a little bit about what that means to you as a veteran watching these young people be scathed instead of the kings who sent them there?
Yeah, it's tough to think about. I mean, as in the military, the experience is deeply class conscious on all kinds of levels. Not necessarily in so many words, but class is always front and center of, I think, just about every military encounter I've ever had. Because in part, there are strict hierarchies that are based on education and affluence or relative ability to make connections with people who have power. For example, West Point requires a congressional, basically, letter. So you have to be you have to be connected to your local representative if you want to get into West Point, something that poor kids and kids who otherwise have a hard time engaging in those kind of activities that would link them are just going to have a hard time doing. So people who go into places like West Point are very affluent and connected in various ways, even if they maybe they didn't grow up super wealthy, but they certainly have that kind of connections that other people even lack the understanding of. And it was woven into all of those interactions, and the sense that people knew they were poor, they knew they were disconnected. For some people, the first time they ever had access to like healthcare, dental care was a big one, eye care, regular meals, places to sleep that weren't necessarily super dangerous, although the barracks I lived in weren't great, but still better than what they possibly come from. Many of them came from hard luck backgrounds. In fact, I stood out deeply because I came from an upper middle class background, and it showed.
Mm.
And I definitely stood out under most circumstances that way.
Interesting. The band does write about the idea of vengeance in Name and Address Withheld. The bully who never learns, wishing them more unhappy returns. And there's the chickens coming home to roost. And it's sort of like the I told you so vengeance lyrics. Is that unique to American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan? I mean, could you imagine people saying that about any other war in history? Any thoughts on that?
Ooh, yeah, that's where it gets a little squishy, a little tough. I mean, Civil War had riots, and particularly New York in 1863, had the U.S. military shelling New York City because of the riots there. And that certainly involved a lot of ugly feelings about who should return and in what form. Vietnam War is another good one to jump from. World War II is a bit complicated. The people who most stood against the war were on the far right, conservatives, whatnot, people who felt that Nazi Germany was basically okay and the Russians or the Soviets were the real horror creators of the world, not Nazi Germany, were the true sources of horror of the world. And with Vietnam, I think it got really ugly at times. That there's interviews after Kent State where an older person said, if my son had been there, I would want him shot because he disobeyed a lawful order from the National Guard, from the civil governance. And when you do that, you get shot. So, I mean, yeah, it's not easy to collect these voices because of how self-censored people were in many ways. But historically, there have been bad feelings about wars and about outcomes, and not everyone always felt that their fellow Americans who were fighting were in fact fellow Americans and deserved respect and honor. And in fact, that's really a creation of the post-1970s political culture in which the soldier has to hate the war, not the warrior, where the soldier has to kind of be forgiven preemptively for anything they may or may not have been asked to do.
You just said something really important. Hate the war, not the warrior. What do you think the band is trying to teach about that statement about hating the war, not the warrior? Do you think they're saying anything particular about that?
Well, I think they're getting at the crux of the problem of at that time it was 25 years of that mantra weaving its way into the lives of people who are connected to the United States. Because Chris, if I'm not misunderstanding his background, actually lived in the United States because of a stepfather, I believe, who was in the military or something like that. And I think he's kind of challenging that because he's pointing out that with an all-volunteer military, people like myself willingly took rifles in our hands, knowing what comes out the other end of a rifle and what comes out the other end of the enemy's rifle. And I think he's willing to point out that he's expected to mourn dead Americans who are the executioner's willing citizens. And how difficult that can be when you're anti-war and you were screaming that the Iraq war was going to be the worst mistake ever, only to find that people are upset now that Americans are being killed overseas when this didn't have to be.
So, Chris, you already mentioned Star Wars, and I'm curious with these pop culture references, which I think maybe when I first heard this, I thought they stood out maybe too much. Like they were too obvious or too on the nose, and I wasn't quite sure either the purpose or the effectiveness of them. How do you think these references, New Hope for Breakfast, The Empire Preemptively Strikes Back, the voice of Luke's father, how did these references fit in with the other ideas in Name and Address Withheld?
Yeah, I think it gets back to the idea that everyone thinks they're Luke in the X-Wing and, they're taking on the big empire, but they're not. They're the stormtroopers. And we are the empire, so we have to understand that, Luke's father is on CNN describing the war in great ways and crying when the U.S. soldiers are killed while dismissing the death of Iraqis. I mean, trying to, for example, teach the Iraq invasion is tough because it's tough to convey what really happened thanks to how thoroughly discredited and dissolved or disappeared or just not covered thoroughly in English language media were the deaths. I mean, the U.S. military adopted a policy, as far as I know, is still in effect, where it's refused to count civilian deaths, and it did so because of Vietnam. So it took an overt stance, the death of people who are not U.S. military, which I think that itself was eventually disappeared. The numbers stopped being counted or released as a means of running the war. So like, I think it hits at a strikingly important concept, but I do think that since this is one of the few times where propaganda has used such overt pop cultural language, that it does kind of stand out among their songs, and especially the album.
So you said with not acknowledging and not addressing the loss of civilian life, and what I think is also important coming like from the civilian side is the dehumanization of the enemy. So I'm curious what you think, if the use of racial epithets in the song was like risky or a gamble. Do you think like the context of the lyrics warrant their use?
Yeah. Whew. So at the time, I was willing to accept the use because it was so controversial, because using the N-word to describe people of Arab descent is something I had heard. Certainly, of course, calling them other words that he uses were stuff that I heard. And I think he got at a truth at the time about the easiness with which people use this language and how disgusting it was, because of course he frames it in a way that tries to juxtapose fawning over the dead US soldiers while also ignoring and dehumanizing the people who the US soldiers were sent to kill,
right?
Including, of course, kids. And yeah, nowadays, I don't know how he sings it live. If he does, I hope he doesn't use the word or figures out a way to make it work without it, because I think it's a relic of its time at best, which is never a good defense, in the sense that, saying that word at all is basically a losing game. So if you're going to do it, you got to make sure you know what you're doing. And I think at the time, like I said, I could understand the context because I had heard that word used before. It wasn't that uncommon.
Right.
And I could get behind drawing people's attention to it in a negative light.
So like whenever you were enlisted, these were things that you personally were experiencing coming out of people's mouths.
Sure. And white suburbia.
Yeah.
I grew up around a decent amount of East Asian and South Asian and Middle Eastern descended kids, and these kind of things were thrown around. And it was, it wasn't the first time I'd heard it. Was when I was in the military.
Yeah, I don't know when Propaganda last played this song. I've never seen them play it live. I didn't see them play it live in 2007 on the tour supporting this record. I would like to hear Chris do an episode of this on his podcast someday to talk about, his reflections on his lyrical usage within this song, because it's really fascinating. Chris, do you have any other lines in the song that really jump out at you for any reason in particular?
Yeah. One of the things that made me really think about what he was saying with this song was when he says informal wars, that there's an endless list of them, then they create dead people, and the justifications are on the screen. And anyone who's watched or grew up at a time when Rambo movies were popular, this is a formerly tragic war survivor turned superstar, war like a Adonis, a model, a Hercules, a demigod of fighting U.S. wars. And thinking about, for example, how the United States understood Afghanistan and U.S. participation in Afghanistan in the 1980s, it was through things like Sylvester Stallone's movies, which helped put a positive spin on helping the Mujahideen as they waged a war against the invading Soviet military, or with Schwarzenegger in his own movies that portrayed commando-like actions, special operations actions, in a positive light, or presented them as if they're mere adventures, Teddy Roosevelt style, where you're just going out in the brush, fighting the people you got to fight, but ultimately you're the hero and the good guy. And that this use of entertainment to inform and justify U.S. foreign policy has this kind of dark element to it when he's bringing up New Hope and pointing out that Darth Vader on the TV screen explaining to you what the war is about, not Luke Skywalker.
Chris, earlier we were talking before we were recording a little bit about Propaganda's mentions of the military throughout their entire recorded discography. I'm thinking of songs like Albright Monument Baghdad, Stick the Flag, Name and Address, Coach's Corner. What are some of your thoughts on how Propaganda has discussed the troops and military over the course of their career?
Yes, that's excellent. I mean, it's talk about there's a couple subjects that Propaganda covers in ways that I find really very satisfying, because I think in part it's not that common. And one of the first might be I Was a Preteen McCarthyist.
Mm-hmm.
That's the one where he touches the A-10 Warhogs, gigantic Gatling gun, the tank killing gun. And I could really appreciate that, grappling with growing up with something being good and then realizing as you grow older that it's not what you thought it was. And I grew up that way. I mean, I was clashing G.I. Joe soldiers into each other the time I could,
absolutely same here,
functionally pinch them,
yeah,
and make them fight. And
it's so cute to think about too.
Sure, I'm sure my mom's got happy memories of me sitting on the floor going pew 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 pew, like I was Elliot in E.T.
Yeah,
and just growing up and realizing that the message you thought you should be learning isn't going to sustain you in the adult world when you learn more about what's really going on. And so that song, I think, sets a good tone. But I think there might be more, but I know a trio of songs that I was just listening to that I think really make a strong arc, and that would be Albright Monument Baghdad, War is Peace, Slavery is Freedom, May All Your Vengeance Be Humanitarian, off of it's one of the Fat compilations. Of course, I have to scroll through real quick.
Wait, what song are you talking about?
Live Fat, Die Young.
Oh, yeah.
War is Peace, Slavery is Freedom, May All Your Vengeance Be Humanitarian, where he says, I'm reduced to nothing more than cheering on embassy bombings. And he sings a huge chunk of the song grappling with the nature of sitting in a room watching a television screen in which these warlike actions are done in his name, and feeling kind of hopeless about the situation, and then drinking himself stupid because he feels so hopeless and so disconnected from the making stuff happen. And that's really similar themes to, I think, Albright Monument, in which he's singing about Clinton's Iraq shenanigans, which we shouldn't forget. They existed and they were sad. And the way in which it seemed invisible how cruel U.S. foreign policy was to Iraq, and how invisible the people who suffered really were. Because, of course, Madeleine Albright infamously says on camera that if it takes killing Iraqi kids to bring down Saddam Hussein under the sanctions regimes, then so be it. And then it ending with this song with Name and Address Withheld, which seems like the culmination of a mini arc.
What else are we forgetting about the Clinton Iraq shenanigans? Does anything jump out at you really would like to remind listeners about what happened in the 90s?
Sure. I mean, so beginning actually the month that Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 90, there were sanctions that lasted all the way till 2013. I believe they were officially dropped maybe May 2003. And they were intermittently ratcheted up. And after Iraq withdrew from Kuwait, they were based on ideas that Saddam Hussein was pursuing weapons of mass destruction to try to prevent him from doing so. And of course, if you're, say, a fan of Noam Chomsky or something like that, you may be realizing that Iraq is probably doing this because they know that they're going to get invaded, and the way you don't get invaded by the United States is have a nuclear weapon pointed at Washington. But the sanctions lasted until the war began, and intermittently throughout Clinton's administration, Iraq would occasionally appear or pop up with various things. Most strongly would be around the time of the hearings over him being impeached, and that was during Operation Desert Fox, where there were certainly rumors that we were going to invade Iraq again. And several missiles were launched, and it was this big international strong-arm hubbubaloo that gave rise to wag the dog claims and such like that.
So, Chris, is there anything about Name and Address Withheld? Let's talk about something fun musically that stands out to you as a longtime Propaganda fan. How do you feel about the performance of the song?
Yeah, I really like it. I like how it comes after the heavier Todd songs, and it's just like not exactly airy, but it's like that intro just has this like lightness to it that I really like. It's got a real crisp sound to it, and I think it's more than I realized. It does connect today's empires with less talk as they were moving into the sounds that they really developed with Dejurgen Merchet and speculative fiction as they're developing the sound that would be more realized maybe in their follow-up albums.
So, Chris, you recently tweeted, "There is no learning from history or the lessons of history. There's only studying the past to understand it on its own terms as interpreted through current concerns." So how does that fit in with studying the Iraq War and other U.S. military conflicts?
Yeah, that's awesome thing you asked. Thanks. I didn't expect that. That's me being a bit, I mean, it's a bit me being a historian in the sense that one of the things I think that sets being a historian apart from other kinds of scholarship, other kinds of analysis is our field is built upon the idea that the past exists in its own right. And while we can't really know it, we can use tools influenced by modern day concerns to understand it as best we can on its own terms. So the point of studying the Iraq War is not so that a future Iraq War won't happen per se, because what is unfolding as you live and as you're interacting with people isn't something that can be remedied by just saying, oh, but if you only don't have a, I don't know, Bush presidency, which has a severe credibility issue thanks to the Supreme Court decision, a opposition party that's kind of fragmented, fractured, trying to reconstruct itself after a deeply embarrassing presidential end to an otherwise incredibly popular president, to the point where he didn't even support the vice president running in the election after he couldn't run. You have an international system in which it seemed like the country, the United States, had no end and no boundaries, and the big foreign competitors like Japan are brought low by a massive economic catastrophe that they still, by the way, haven't recovered from. So it's not to say that things can't be helpful to learn, but it's that the lessons don't inform themselves. And the real way you know the past and the real use of the past is understanding it because it happened on its own terms, meaning that the events that led to the Iraq War didn't come from things that you'll know when you look into it, but came from things that were happening at the time. And the best we can do is understand it. And I was really thinking about what people might say about current actions to try to address racial issues, racial injustices, policing, and the COVID-19 pandemic, because both were issues that, as a historian, you could point and say, look, we know what to do, right? We have plenty of models. I mean, I studied and written about disease eradication in my own work, and I've studied various aspects of policing through studying the far left and particularly the far right, California 1960s. And me knowing this stuff doesn't change the outcome. And other people are going to argue something entirely different. And it doesn't take long going through Twitter to find takes that argue different things should happen. And it's also kind of a mistake to assume that we're the only people who've ever studied history. So I did put a little addendum, but 3,000 years ago, they were studying the past. Even more, they would have shaped their own outcomes better if they potentially could have. So it's really a call to action that we are the present creators of the future. It's up to us to make that future happen. And we're trapped. we're temporally located. We can't get out of that. And I appreciate you asking about it.
Well, Chris, it has been a real pleasure to have you back on the show, Unscripted Moments, to talk about another propaganda song named Nidus Withheld, and to also tie in continuously your personal experiences within the military, your academic studies, and your intellectual pursuits, and helping us tie these threads that are woven throughout this catalog of music. We are super grateful to you for once again coming on here and helping us elevate the conversation about a nuanced and complicated song that has a lot going on. And I don't know, I just feel like we sort of couldn't have done this without you. So we're super grateful to you for your time and energy to come on the show and talk about this song with us.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
That was awesome to have Chris Deutsch back on the show. Thanks again to Chris for coming on the show. I know that Chris will be back again soon, too, for another appearance that is in the works. I'm not going to spoil that, but I know that Chris will be back on the show again real soon. So thank you again, Chris. All right, Keith. So let's get into this thing. Where do you want to start tonight?
Let's talk about the lyrics first, Greg.
All right. Just to set the stage a little bit, I found a little bit more in that Punk News interview where Chris Hanna says that Name and Address is a meditation on my own ability to make the distinction between vengeance and justice.
Mm-hmm.
I was brought up with the line between the two blurred at best and consequently still grapple with that. Put simply, this song and Speculative Fiction are laments about conflict resolution in human history, that the removal of tyrants has typically been nothing more than a changing of guard, with liberators and humanitarians simply becoming the new tyrants, which is super interesting to me, considering at the end of Rock for Sustainable Capitalism episode on Chris's Patreon, he talked about the very unique choice that us here in the U.S. had to recently make. And then he also goes on to say, songs like Name and Address, Withheld, and the Speculative Fiction are meditations on the concepts of justice and vengeance with specific geopolitical contexts. People, including myself, have been bred with mixed messages that often leave them confused about which is which, but there is no justice in vengeance. That's the bottom line of those songs. So it almost seems to me here, like Chris is saying, that Name and Address, Withheld, and Speculative Fiction kind of speak to each other from across the record as sort of like a pairing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, an answer back and coming back to that idea that hasn't necessarily been wrapped up yet.
So what do you think about the lyrics? Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I don't know. I have to say that I think in the mid 2000s, in early 2000, during and just after the U.S. invasion of Iraq, there was just this paint by numbers formula in writing anti-war songs at that time. I mean, there was Rock Against Bush, which brought together these fledgling artists, but maybe also veteran artists to all take a stance against something in some admirable but also questionable ways, I would argue. Also being involved in electoral politics, with varying degrees of success, depending on actually being elected or making money and profiting off of it. The song is an articulate denouncement of the media, of Hollywood, of flag wavers, who never really questioned the narratives of the wars that they've been sold. And I think Chris's feelings of hopelessness and that feeling of being alone as these endless wars rage on, now you find him questioning his own, as you said, these inclinations possibly toward vengeance, because these ideas have been misrepresented. They've been confused. They've been there in not only media, but in a sense, also like our understanding of history in the textbooks that we're forced to read in schools. Those things all being connected together with some idea of righteousness and divine establishment of a country, and it being guided and protected while we go on a global rampage with essentially no accountability. I think today's empires and Potemkin City, to me, everyone says Failed States is the darkest, and it definitely has a sound and a mood and a tone to it that are dark. But today's empires and Potemkin City, I think, just have this feeling of empty hopelessness.
Yeah, and I agree with all that. It's really interesting as well to think about the tones of this record that Chris is talking about. But, and I also think about like the opening lines. Like I listened to this song so many times today, and I just kept thinking, wow. So the following views expressed. I mean, how many times have you ever heard that, where there's like the following view is not necessarily the view of blah, blah, blah. And it's like this disclaimer that people always put into like organizational pamphlets or in political advertisements to absolve themselves of any responsibility in case people find themselves upset about the things that follow in that message. It's like, oh, but we told you in the very beginning that the following views do not necessarily reflect the stance of so-and-so organization who is like further up the ladder. But then it goes on to say, those of the prevailing order who prostrate to their naked kings, tailor the seams of funeral shrouds on foreign shores, shed no tears for the dead, of the endless list of informal wars, the justification for will be spelled out coming soon to a screen near you. And that opening line is so damning. Like, think of all like I just keep picturing this endless line of sycophants and suck ups and brown nosers who defend the indefensible. You could put presidents on that list like Bush or Trump or whatever. We're currently watching it in real time as like a whole lot of folks who are just okay with a broad daylight tyrannical power grab by a president who refuses to leave power willingly. And it's truly tragic, sad, and boring to have to watch it happen in my own country, and how many of the people defending it are people who 10 years ago would never consider doing such a thing. And it's hard to believe how much farther we have fallen from the time when this record was released. Because you think about 2005, man, and it was dark. I think about being like 18 to 25. And those endless war years, which are still going, obviously, but, so many people in my age bracket and your age bracket were afraid of getting drafted in those years.
Yeah, and the ubiquitous nature, I think, of the endless wars, not just on television, learning about it in the classes that we took maybe in high school and after graduation, but in the culture that it is represented everywhere in these tangled threads of movies and shows and video games about the wars that we're still fighting.
Mm-hmm.
Right? They're being pumped out at a rate that is, and the fact that we're still occupying those countries and territories. And, they're being released in theaters or premiering on TV, shaping and twisting and spinning those events before we really have time to even understand it unfolding and processing in front of our eyes.
Well, and I remember being in a dorm room at the University of Missouri and watching the war debut live on television, the sacking of Baghdad in 2003. Like, I watched it on TV like it was some kind of, entertainment to be, a spectacle. And then the whole shock and awe thing. And it really brings the words coming soon to a screen near you in the song into context. Like, thinking back how I was glued to my screen watching Baghdad be overrun by U.S. forces, and voila, coming soon to a screen near me, pumped into my dorm room in my freshman year of college. And the entire time sitting there thinking, I don't want to go there. I don't want to be in that conflict. That has nothing to do with me. And it's just this way that it could have really gone either way. And all the uncertainty that went with that really freaks me out. And it also reminds me of World War II propaganda, where people would fill movie theaters and be shown clips and footage of war efforts. And, just for years and years now, it's just pumped right into our gaping eyeballs on Fox News and MSNBC. And, it's really troubling. So yeah, what lines do you have next?
The next part where it says, I'm feeling less hopeful and so much less human as my days are reduced to little more than settling for revenge and wondering whatever happened to the kid that pledged first do no harm. I think the song really finds the band feeling hopeless and alone as these endless wars are raging on, questioning their own inclinations toward things like vengeance amid this media feedback loop of spin. And I even think of myself and how far I've come from being a Boy Scout in fourth and fifth grade, pledging to do my honor and duty to God and country.
Yeah.
And how we are expected to and conditioned to memorize and to praise, but how rarely we are given the necessary skills or the materials to really question and to learn and to analyze, to be able to understand those things are happening for us, to where we just immediately pledge our loyalty to not just the symbols that represent oppression and empire and death and destruction, but also individuals who are carrying out death and destruction and this like new age empire.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that I feel really sort of a kindredness with Chris Hanna on, in the fact that he was raised and he openly talks frequently about the ways that he was raised in a military family, being spoon-fed these things. The song "I Was a Preteen McCarthyist," all these things that consistently come out in his work. But he also tells the story a ton about growing up and having to like sort of unprogram or unlearn a lot of things that he was that were learned for him. So it's that same way of receiving instead of thinking. And so there's a lot of things that are kind of wrong with schools, or that are wrong with like overzealous parenting that steers children in very specific directions and in very specific worldviews, pretty much against the kid's will. Thinking about all the different ways that can manifest themselves over the course of that kid's life is pretty wild as well.
Yeah, I just think of all the times in my past and even now present, when you said deprogramming yourself, when I'm really defensive, when some new idea or fact or detail jolts me out of my thinking, right? Whenever that happens now, whenever I read something that challenges my either my privilege in the world or my circumstances or my understanding of something, typically I just I can't help but knee jerk and think, well, that can't be it, right? Like that can't be right. Or why aren't you talking about this also? Rather than really just taking time to think about what issue is being raised, try to soak in what they're trying to tell me.
Yeah, and you and I share that. The whole notion of being, conflict averse is something that is so deeply ingrained in me. I have many instances in my own life where I could have done many things that would have been outwardly advancing an agenda that I believe to be the correct direction for the world. And I didn't, because, it's a very cowardly thing in a lot of ways for me, but it's also just a fear of conflict in general. It really freaks me out. And so, I've been a poor activist in general. I'm trying to make sense of that within my own self as well.
I think the way the song has this 180-degree turn, musically and lyrically, those allusions to Star Wars. So fed too much New Hope for breakfast, and the voice of Luke's father, the Empire preemptively strikes back. Also, Bad Religion's album and song, The Empire Strikes First, comes to mind.
Great album.
Yeah, with the same concept, positing that we're the empire. But just think of, even though how similar they are in many ways, like how much more this song ultimately says. And that description of Chris basically saying that we are in fact the empire, and we are giving voice to Darth Vader, and we allow them equal airtime to be able to justify, to spin, and to make arguments for the dehumanizing of countless numbers of human populations, and for the destruction of distant places that the majority of Americans will never understand, will never read about, will never learn about, will never care about after this. That's a heavy idea, and that sort of speaks to, I think, media literacy, the dire need of media literacy within schools. I can't say starting at what age, but in helping students develop baloney detectors, for lack of a better term, as Carl Sagan would kind of call it.
Yeah.
Just to be able to pick up on, using background knowledge and using critical thinking, picking up on information that's setting off some red flags and some alarms. So I know I didn't get that in school, and I know I struggle probably with those skills on my own. I try my best to try to incorporate that into my classroom, because, let's say that we are analyzing 5 different versions of anecdotes or accounts of the Boston Massacre. Like, I had to spell out to my students 25 years from now, this isn't going to benefit you. Like this knowledge of which version shows Crispus Attucks being shot and which version leaves him out, like that specific tidbit is not going to be helpful to you in some way. But in being able to analyze and evaluate various resources, look for bias, to look for perspective, to try to see the author's purpose, to try to use those things collectively, right? All those different accounts and narratives to come up with a bigger picture while evaluating each one. That's a skill that you can use in the workplace. You know, if you are trying to get a loan, if you're trying to read the newspaper or vote, we as a country just kind of consume. You know, that's who we are. Our identity is just consumption. And it has the same to do with information, to where we take things in and we're unable to process things or to think critically about it. And I just kind of gesture wildly around and say, look at where we are now, to see that writ large across America today.
We think about the wars that Chris is referring to within the song, and the clear ones that spring to mind would be Iraq and Afghanistan, and then he hits us with two racial epithets in a row.
Right.
Tell me what you think about that, because I found a little bit of detail on that as well that I'll talk about after you say what you think.
I think at the time I was pretty much like on board, understanding the purpose and understanding why he would go that far. I mean, listening to it, if you're really paying attention, if you hadn't heard it before, and if you could pick out the words, I think that still, for me, the air goes out of the room every time that part of name and address comes up, and it leaves you thinking about what you've heard and what it means. I mean, it wasn't long after 9/11 over by my house in my parents' house in Indiana that people already put up in their fence, like their chain link fence around the yard, kill them all and let God sort them out. Or working at a grocery store, and a man in a turban came into the grocery store and someone clearly yelled one of these same epithets.
Mm-hmm.
So seeing this in the dehumanizing language, while also pretending to be the democratizers, the people bringing civilization to other parts of the world, while not granting individuals dignity. I don't know. I think it's complicated. And I think what Chris Deutsch ultimately said about its use, he really laid it out appropriately. Yeah, I think there's no easy way to talk about this part. Greg, what are your thoughts?
Well, and another thing that stands out to me about your example about a person walking into a grocery store in a turban is that, in my mind, clearly that person is a Sikh from the Punjab region of northwest India on the border of Pakistan, where the Sikhs have their spiritual home in the city of Amritsar. It's just a tremendous religious illiteracy in general that people in the United States exemplify, while also clinging most likely to one particular religion as well, while also demonizing and completely misunderstanding the outward appearance and the way that people of other religions and traditions present themselves in public. After 9/11, like, so many Sikhs were beaten and harassed, and it's just absolutely ridiculous. But I was looking at Chris's Patreon, and there's an incredible conversation that took place over there when Chris put up his mix of Name and Address Withheld from the G7 compilation. And I really enjoyed the conversation that sprung up because Chris preemptively discussed his discomfort with the presence of racial epithets in this song. I think that it's important to talk about that on our show, because I recognize that there might be a lot of listeners for our show who don't subscribe to Chris's Patreon and can't hear his own thoughts on these racial epithets, because in order to hear them or read them, you'd have to be a subscriber. We've also talked about how Chris has revised usage of lyrics, like in Rock for Sustainable Capitalism, where he says jackass, mohawk, millionaire now, but that's not how it appears on the record. But on the Patreon recently, Chris very clearly says he feels wrong about these epithets coming out of his mouth. They don't play this song live, like at all anymore. And he said that if they were to play this song live again in the future, that a revision of the lyrics that he felt comfortable with would need to occur. He does sing it as it appears on the record on the Live from Occupied Territory DVD, which was recorded, I think, in 2003. You know, Chris does an amazing job at engaging with patrons on his Patreon page, and he wrote a comment in relation to the epithets that reads, "For me, it's less about what the culture around me is saying about what is or isn't appropriate to put in a song. It's more about how I personally feel about it now. It just doesn't sit right. I don't want to hear or feel those words coming out of my mouth, even in a context critical of the slurs themselves.
Yeah.
I understand the intention behind using such words in art for the purpose of shining a light on reality, but it just doesn't resonate with me anymore." So those are Chris's words directly, fairly recently as well. So, and I felt it was important to share that because, like I said, not everybody would read Chris's Patreon. I think that that's an important thing to share because maybe there are a lot of listeners out there who that song just doesn't sit right with them. And one guy on the Patreon even said, "I sing along to that song in my car like every time it comes on, but when that part comes, I stop singing." And that's how I am too. I stop singing too. I don't sing it. So I completely respect Chris's reflection on this and his changing view on that over the years. I think that's just kind of the mark of an educated mind, being able to critique one's own self and being able to change one's mind over time is really respectable to me.
I think that would be about what I was expecting him to say. Definitely feeling uneasy, not feeling comfortable, having them certainly like recorded with him singing it, but those words down on paper. There's so many lessons there to address in all of our own actions, into which we can acknowledge the things that we've done, and then maybe we have a point, and then we really focus on what the point was, but ultimately overlook on what its unintended consequences might have been.
Yeah. And, you know, the notion of informal wars and Chris's discussion of the endless list of informal wars, I think that's a really worthwhile conversation for you and I to explore for a couple minutes. But do you have any thoughts on that line, endless list of informal wars?
With my students, we do this activity where we try to evaluate various foreign policies, platforms throughout U.S. history. And for 8th grade, it's kind of complex stuff. They start with Monroe, they go up to Teddy Roosevelt, up to Clinton, to Obama, obviously Cold War policy. Throughout that, as they're looking at global events and seeing how the United States is positioning itself in certain places for, of course, its own economic and geopolitical benefit, I hit them with this resource called From Wounded Knee to Syria, U.S. Military Interventions Since 1890 by Dr. Zoltan Grossman from Evergreen State College in Olympia, Washington. It's a list that has U.S. interventions overseas and even within the United States as well. So the country or the state, so the place, the date, the forces sent, and then a short description. And usually I ask my students about how many times we've formally declared war as a nation. And they typically will say like, a dozen, 2 dozen. The number is so off because, well, we've just been at war for so long. And for them to understand that it's just 5 times while looking at this list that includes sending U.S. troops to Idaho and Korea and Chicago and Samoa, Panama, Nicaragua. I mean, if you go through the list, it really makes you think then about the versions of the United States that we've been sold and convinced to believe to be true, seeing the impact elsewhere while not even really understanding what the consequences were, like not even knowing that these things happened in the first place and wondering how many else we'll be able to add in the present or in the coming years.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that also reminds me, did you say 5 times?
5 times. The U.S. has formally declared war 5 times.
Oh,
Congress, yeah, that's it.
well, and I know that we were in Vietnam for more than 10 years with no formal declaration of war, right?
Right.
And I was looking at this as well. You and I were like going down a couple of the similar rabbit holes, I think, because I found that on 125 occasions, a president has deployed armed forces without authorization from Congress. For example, Korean War, which saw the death of over 140,000 Americans. Remember a couple of years ago when we fired 59 Tomahawk missiles into Syria? Those cost $1.4 million each. Nobody even seems to remember that now. You know, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I. I mean, so those are the couple of the declarations. But I found that we haven't declared war since 1942. But so many things, all we know is war, I feel like. There's so many things where, like, it's just endless. But there hasn't been a formal declaration since 1942, which really is crazy. But the formal declarations were War of 1812, Mexican-American, Spanish-American, World War I, and World War II. But it makes me feel a little nuts paying taxes in a nation that engages in undeclared acts of war all over the world. And it seems pretty clear to me that the will of the people is of no concern whatsoever when pursuing acts of undeclared war. War is not popular with American people. And I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about Americans around the world, because we're such a warring nation that a lot of people around the world must assume Americans crave war. You know, like without undeclared acts of war, Congress and presidents would have the ability to engage in highly questionable pursuits without much real accountability. And it's pretty wild thinking about all the stuff that I don't know that has gone on behind the scenes. I've read a couple things. You know, there's a book out there by Jeremy Scahill, who is a really well-known journalist, but he wrote a book called Dirty Wars about...
Yeah.
Did you read that book or see the documentary that is associated with it?
Yeah, I read that and Blackwater.
Oh, man. He chronicles in one part of the book the Obama administration hunting down Anwar al-Awlaki, an American Muslim cleric who was a religious leader in Falls Church, Virginia, just outside of D.C. Al-Awlaki said a lot of incendiary things. He went to Yemen, and when he was in Yemen, he was killed by a drone strike. So he was an American citizen. There was no due process. There was no CIA extrication effort. Just boom, dead, drone strike. And then 2 weeks later, al-Awlaki's son, Abdul Rahman, was killed by another drone. And then in 2017, al-Awlaki's 8-year-old daughter was killed in a strike in Yemen, ordered by Trump. And Abdul Rahman was killed sitting like in an open air cafe, and I think he was 16. I think about all these other wars that are endless now. Iraq has cost 1.9 trillion. Afghanistan cost 2 trillion. The Libyan intervention was 550 million. And so when I think about that massive list that Zoltan Grossman put up on his Evergreen site about endless wars, and I see figures in the trillions for recent wars, it's pretty surreal to think about the immensity of that and how that just weighs over this entire country and all the places abroad where we have engaged in undeclared conflict, and all the fallout through the killings of people in all those other places that we're complicit in their deaths.
So that takes me back then, Greg, to Chris grappling with the idea of vengeance and revenge. So if the U.S. is the empire from Star Wars, shouldn't we be rooting against them? I mean, if America is the bully, well, then how should we feel then if the bully gets a black eye? And that's a complicated question, and I have no clear answer. And I grieve, but I also know it's more complicated than just good guys versus bad guys.
Yeah, you know, the bully that never learns line from the song really stands out there. And there's another book that jumps out at me that I'm thinking of called Overthrow by a writer named Stephen Kinzer.
Yeah.
And in that book, I think there are 10 chapters, and he documents overthrows of sovereign governments, including the Kingdom of Hawaii.
Right. I always share that with my students, and they're blown away when they find out that the federal government overthrew a monarchy there.
Yeah, and so it's well documented. These things are not secrets, and it's immensely depressing to be told your entire life that you come from such a righteous and just and equal place, full of opportunity, full of innovation, and then you get to see just how much ugliness there is just below the surface as you age, and then this slow creeping realization for me that so much of what I thought was true was a complete lie. But I am also very grateful that my eyes were opened by a few key teachers of mine that said, hey, kid, you got to read this. And I'd like to think that Chris Hanna, being somebody who, grew up, he mentions that he was fairly conservative as a really young kid. And I'd imagine that he has a few essential people in his life like that as well. So I'm thinking about a few very special people. For example, the guy who gave me Overthrow when I was like 19. I'm really grateful that there are a few people out there that went out of their way to help me see things in a new way,
Yeah, that's awesome. I actually gave that book to Jason Netherton from Misery Index, since he had their first EP was called the Overthrow EP, which reminds me again of a lyric from them called Black Sites. Our pious preached morality, we're fed until we choke. Our rhetoric so righteous rings a joke to the world. And the ideas of what we think about ourselves, but how perhaps the rest of the world sees us.
Oh, and something else that I just thought of as well that's kind of a funny thing is the opening line of the song reminds me of the opinions expressed are those of the Shell Petroleum Company from the public disservice announcement from Let's Talk More Rock. And I'm guessing now that since that's a song on the record, we'll have to do an episode about public disservice announcement.
Yeah.
I actually just found a couple of neat sources about the topic discussed in public disservice. And so I guess maybe we'll do a 40-minute episode on that one instead of a 2-hour marathon on public disservice. But you never know with us. I mean, I feel like we could just get into the history of everything behind that song, and maybe we'll turn it into a 2-hour marathon as well, even though it's just like an interlude track on that record. We want to make things on ourselves as hard as possible, don't we, Keith?
The fans.
Yeah. So hey, everybody. So what's another line that really stands out to you?
There are a couple other really unique references. At least I assume I'm picking up on like a historical citation here. The executioner's willing citizens. I'm so sorry, and I'm trying to think it through, but when the chickens came home to roost and hand-delivered matching funeral urns to the bully that never learns, I could have sworn I heard a chorus rise and fall. Man, that line is incredibly powerful. But the chickens came home to roost, I'm guessing, is maybe a reference to Malcolm X, who commented on Kennedy's assassination being the result of the climate of hate and violence and imperialism within the United States, but across the globe. I mean, even Martin Luther King Jr. said the United States government was the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. It's something else I have to remind my students that right before he was assassinated, his approval rating was something like in the 20s or 30s. It was fairly often lower than President Trump's throughout these last 4 years. And that's something that we don't really know, and definitely younger people don't acknowledge, because everyone talks about him in such a two-dimensional way. They leave out the things that made him controversial, like saying the American government is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And then the executioner's willing citizens. I'm thinking maybe this is a reference to a book written by Harvard professor Daniel Goldhagen. He argued in his popular but controversial book, Hitler's Willing Citizens, that the majority of Germans willingly participated in the Holocaust and were in varying degrees compliant and complicit in the murder of millions of people.
That statement isn't shocking to me anymore. and it shouldn't have been the entire time. Like saying that massive amounts of people in a certain country at a certain time when an atrocity was carried out were complicit in their silence and their deference. That should not have surprised me for the longest time in my life, but it always did. But it doesn't anymore. It's scary. There's also a reference in the song to naked kings, which reminds me. I mean, first of all, think about that. What that means now, the naked kings. It reminds me of like the Emperor's New Clothes by Hans Christian Andersen, where everybody just tells the king exactly what he wants to hear, so that they don't sound dumb. But the problem is that everyone wants the king's assistants to shout it out loud. And an example recently is when John Bolton was talking about impeachable offenses, but months after Trump's actual impeachment, which is so nuts. So I'm constantly thinking about the Naked King right now. That's a reference that this song really, really resonates with me in this particular moment in time that we're living through, especially with the refusal to concede, because that undermines something about the United States that I think is actually great, maybe one of the only things about this country that's actually great, which is the peaceful transition of power. And now we have a crybaby boy king, Donald wept through the proceedings, that we're currently dealing with. And so I think a lot about naked kings right now as well.
Yeah, and replacing the Secretary of Defense just with someone who's going to just going to agree with him.
Yeah. Well, and then we have the closing line, which your quote that you just read about chickens coming home to roost leads into, and it's every war waged, only kings emerged unscathed. And while I love the idea of this song, because who dies in wars? Well, not kings. It's all the rest of the folks who are herded into it. But Chris Deutsch said something that really stuck with me about how many monarchs were felled by World War I. And I looked up a few, such as the Kingdom of Montenegro, the Russian Empire, Albania, Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Kingdom of Prussia, and many more that all had throne abdications. But I know there was some of them were killed and some of them were not, but I imagine a lot were physically unscathed for the most part as far as like violence goes. So maybe they emerge unscathed but abdicated of their monarchy.
Or kings in today's sense is going to be CEOs, the senior members of the Senate. Those individuals, maybe not necessarily a literal king, but those with power and position, to where they're going to benefit from war and not actually suffer from it.
Yeah, and the people that are responsible for many of the worst aspects of our 2008 financial collapse, which reverberated around the world.
Right.
They emerged unscathed. So there's so many directions that you can take that conversation. And I can hear listeners like yelling out their own examples. So be sure to comment on that and send us some links or some notes and some stories and some links and some thoughts whenever you, whatever examples you're thinking of about kings emerging unscathed, whether they're kings, CEOs, leaders of some kind, etc. I know we have a little bit of brief thoughts about the music. Tell me what you think about this tune.
Yeah, I think it has some flashes of a pre-Empires sound. There are parts in the beginning that deceptively sound upbeat and uplifting and dancey, to use one of your words, Greg.
Yeah.
And it has a very, very different tone and mood and feel for the first part of it, right? And then it changes so much. It fits so much more, of course, then into like the band's later discography, since they're experimenting so much and there are these different elements all within a single track. And I think the guitars have like a really unique resonating and ringing sound to them. It adds a somber feel as the track progresses, especially with the bridge and the background vocals. The justification for will be spelled out like that part.
Yeah.
I think Jord is really diverse here on the drums. He has an in-your-face punk beat throughout, but evocative fills and emotional flares that add to it, that break from just like kind of a standard pattern. And I would have been, I got to say, if I would have heard this song first, I'm not sure if it would have been one that would have totally amped me up musically, because it was so different from what I heard up to that point. But of course, over time, I've grown with it. And the song has definitely grown with me and made me think about the music and the ideas. But uh, definitely not a barn burner or something that would have maybe caught my ear right away. So you describing your close connection with this very early on, hearing it first, I would just have to guess that maybe it wouldn't have been one that stuck out to me from the beginning.
Yeah, you know, if you think about it, like where the last record left off, Purina Hall of Fame. There's also Mate Kamarisa Kun Rasikan. I mean, today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes is so fast and so metallic, and there's so much like palm muting and riffs and solos and stuff on that record, that this one was quite a big shift. But this was the first tune I heard off Potemkin, and I found it to be really refreshing because it's so melodic, a la Less Talk More Rock in the beginning of the song. And I feel a distinct mood shift where it's got that big long drum fill, and then it's chalk it up, tune over, develop sense. I feel like there's a mood shift right there where that part comes in. And then it gets like really dark and heavy with Empire collectively strikes back. And I feel like there's a shift from the beginning of the song where there's tons of spelled out for me, coming soon to a screen near me, near you. And I feel like the beginning is so sing-songy and it's so catchy. And then the back half of the song, like they do a massive tone shift. And I absolutely love that about this song. And something else that's hugely different about Chris's mix for the Take Penicillin Now G7 comp and the Jason Livermore mix is that the background vocals for the coming soon to a screen near me, near you, that's so different on the Jason Livermore mix because Chris had Todd super high up in the mix. So Todd's background vocals on the near me, near you part is so much louder to where it feels really, really different on that delicate, that coming soon to a screen near me part. I was not expecting this song to feel so bouncy. Like it almost felt like Resisting Tyrannical Government to me off of Less Talk More Rock, which we talked about ages ago, but it's got that same feel where it's a fast song, but it's not Mate Ka Marisa Kun Rasikan fast. It's a very different feel of a fast song. That's kind of my thoughts on this song in general, and I really like the performance. I think it harkens back to Less Talk More Rock, but I think it also combines a lot of what the band excels at in today's Empires, Tomorrow's Ashes. And I think that this was almost a deliberate mashup between those two styles because Chris often talks about how they pushed way too hard on the throttle on the Today's Empires tracks. And this one dials a little bit back off the throttle. And there's a nice little trio of songs on this record of Speculative Fiction, Die Jugend marschiert, Name and Address Withheld that I feel like would almost be like a perfect 2-track A-side, 1-track B-side of a 7-inch. I mean, think about Speculative Fiction, Die Jugend marschiert, and Name and Address Withheld as 3 songs in a row.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wild. It's kind of like my theory of the Todd trilogy of, This Is Your Life, Dark Matters, and Negredo. I feel like this record has a trio of Chris songs, a trilogy, if you will, in Speculative Fiction, Die Jugend, and Name and Address. So I think that's really cool about all this song.
Iteration of that as well, I would.
Oh man, you're so right. Iteration. Okay, so it's a 4-song sequence. And now what I'm going to do later is I'm going to make a Spotify playlist and I'm going to listen to those 4 songs in a row and I'm going to see how they flow together because I love doing that. Because that's what I did with that Todd trilogy is I put them on a single playlist and it's like 8 minutes of perfection. So what is a major lesson that you walk away with on this song?
Yeah, Greg, I think of a student of mine a few years ago who brought up the beating of Rodney King in the LA riots in class. He was shocked that he had never heard about and learned about that event before, whether at home or in school. So I think for me, this makes me think about all of the major events in recent history that have shaped the lives of young people in just immeasurable ways. And I mean, like schools and teachers, we don't give them a way to understand and process and question those things. So much content is heaped onto our curriculum. As an eighth grade teacher, my students, past or present, have never learned about the Iraq War or about Afghanistan in any substantive way in a classroom setting. So it becomes this Mobius strip, as the song states, endless war, without any meaningful context, where we memorialize. It's like we have an annual school-wide activity that is like the equivalent of reading through the names on the Vietnam Wall without actually ever learning or questioning why the names are engraved in the wall in the first place.
This song is very helpful to me in shaping my view that people have completely ordinary lives in countries that the U.S. has been militarily involved with.
Mm-hmm.
I think about how the people who live in other countries have dealt with U.S. presence, military presence, military intervention, oftentimes, military violence in the form of drone strikes in the past several years. If the army of Russia were in the U.S. shooting people with drones, people in the U.S. would absolutely flip out. But we shoot people with drones regularly, and we may see it on the news, but then we get in our car and we go to work or we go to McDonald's or whatever. And I think about how many completely ordinary lives must have been utterly devastated beyond repair at the hands of all of the informal conflict that the U.S. has been involved with around the world for so many years now, and how many innocent lives we have completely destroyed and decimated for probably very, very shallow and very petty reasons in a lot of ways. So what do you rank this one?
Greg, I'm going to say a 4 out of 5. Name and Address Withheld was definitely a grower for me. My interpretation of it evolved over time, and big shout out to Chris Deutsch for helping me kind of update and understand it, I think, in a far better context based off his experiences. I hadn't listened much to the band's first two albums when this came out. Over time, I began to appreciate the blend of different sounds and styles from the band's career. I really like the struggle at the heart of Name and Address, and I think it is a powerful song. I think it's controversial, and I think it's controversial and for a good reason. And I'm glad to have had Chris's book-ended comments to update it and to leave us thinking and reading about what he has to say about it now. What about you?
I am going to give it a 3.5. I like I've come to like a lot of the record more than this song. Back when this record came out, I probably would have said this was my second favorite song behind Speculative Fiction. But as I've aged and as the years have gone by, I have come to appreciate this album in so many other ways that I was not capable of appreciating. And so I like so much of Potemkin City Limits more than this song, which is kind of a shocking discovery to me. But I'm going to give it a 3.5. I could listen to this song, no problem. I'll never skip it. But when Chris said they haven't played it live since the record came out, I understood why not? Do you know what I mean? Like, I wasn't like,
Hmm.
I was like, oh yeah, that kind of makes sense. And then I started thinking about like, well, how do I feel about that? Do I miss it? Do I not miss it? If I don't, why not? And so that kind of said a lot to me, that the band has had this song retired for 15 years and hasn't really bothered to keep it going, even though they indicated that maybe they will play it again someday under an updated and revised version. But yeah, I'm going to give it a 3.5.
Well, I would love to hear how he would tweak and change the lyrics to have something more humane and more inclusive and something more, I guess, timely.
Absolutely. Well, this has been our episode for Name and Address Withheld. If you want to hit us up, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at the handle propagandipod. If you want to email us, you can reach us at propagandipod@gmail.com. I have gotten some of the most amazing emails recently, and I have loved interacting with those of you who shoot me an email over there. Thank you so much. It truly, truly means a lot to hear from people. It's so cliche to say, but it's such a weird lifestyle that I'm now living, where I'm home so often that feeling connected to people outside of my house, even if they're just listeners of the podcast from any random place in the world, it really makes me feel good to hear from all of you. So hit me up, say hi, and we will see you next time.